Dr. Marsha Hewitt is going to be presenting on fluid subjectivities, extended minds, unconscious communication, psychoanalysis, and religion. And Dr. Hewitt is professor of religion in the Faculty of Divinity, Trinity College, and the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in theoretical and clinical psychoanalytic psychology, Holocaust studies, critical theory, psychoanalytic approaches to dreams and visions, and religion and trauma. Her books include Freud on Religion, Critical Theory of Religion, a Feminist Analysis, and From Theology to Social Theory, Juan Luis Segundo and the Theology of Liberation. And a number of those titles are available in our bookstore here this weekend. Marsha has published numerous scholarly articles on critical theory, psychoanalysis, the psychology of religion, feminist theory, and ethics. And she is currently writing Legacies of the Occult, Unconscious Communication at the Interface of Religion and Psychoanalysis. Marsha is also a psychoanalyst in private practice in Toronto in the faraway land of Canada. Someone might throw stones at me, but I will say congratulations on the Raptors' first NBA championship. Please let us warmly welcome Dr. Marsha Hewitt.
We the North, baby. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. This is really a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be able to talk to people and meet people whose work I have read and admired very much over the years. So this is wonderful. I'm going to present a section from my book. It's derived from my book that is forthcoming in the next few months. So I'm a psychoanalyst and I'm a scholar in the study of religion. Both these disciplines address, explore, and compare the nature of subjective experience as individuals and cultures struggle to make meaning. They are discourses of meaning-making that take us into the deeply weird and strange dimensions of psychic reality, the anomalous, the incongruous, the unconscious, the realm of the non-rational. Freud taught long ago that nothing is too trivial or strange for serious psychoanalytic inquiry. He was well aware that the conscious mind represents a very small fraction of human mentation, which is largely unconscious, the realm of fantasies, dreams, longings, desires, both divine and demonic. When I say fantasy, I don't mean that in any pejorative sense, FYI. Psychoanalysis, like religions, struggle to represent those hidden realms where deeper levels of meaning and truth reside. You might say that they are disciplines, discourses of gnosis. I don't say Gnostic, I say gnosis, dedicated to the exploration and representation of mysteries. The deepest levels of the mysteries residing deep within unconscious fantasy and its mind-blowing realities spin their Gnostic threads in religious myths, narratives, symbols, and ritual practices. Psychoanalytic theories like mythologies, religions, and scientific theories, while not reducible and collapsible into intellectual or epistemological equivalencies, are similar in that they are engaged in comparative translating activities of explanation. The study of religions and psychoanalysis provide avenues that take us into some of the occult or hidden dimensions of the human mind. They tell us that there are other worlds than those accessible to ordinary consciousness, more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in philosophy. Freud invoked his favorite quotation from Hamlet in response to Ernest Jones's anxieties around Freud's superstitions, such as telepathy. Jones was flummoxed and upset in the face of what he perceived as an irresolvable contradiction. How could a man as rational as Freud believe in telepathy? Simply stated, Freud encountered instances of it in his clinical practice and outside as well, and he consistently maintained that observation held precedence over theory. a very good thing for psychoanalysts to pay attention to. What Jones could not bring himself to see, which is interesting in itself, is that Freud's belief in telepathy was not an aberration or an outlying contradiction with respect to his general psychoanalytic theories. Freud's view of telepathy was articulated and framed in concert with, not in contradiction to, psychoanalysis as Freud conceived of it. Although his views of telepathy were perfectly compatible with his irreligious psychoanalysis, his irreligious treatment of it ultimately could not be sustained within psychoanalysis after his death, and that's one of the things I argue in the book. Freud regarded telepathy as a human mental capacity or potential, we might say, that originates in the unconscious. But the really interesting question for me is, and Freud didn't shy away from this, is who's unconscious? Freud recognized early on that communication between patient and analyst occur on the levels of verbal and unconscious communication. He accepted without hesitation that important analytic work occurs through what Sandor Ferenczi later called the dialogue of the unconscious, where the unconscious of both analyst and patient drift, intermingle, and generate affective resonances between them. Not only was Freud not particularly troubled by unconscious communication, he recommended that analysts encourage this drift, counseling them to, quote, turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ towards the transmitting unconscious of the patient, 1912. In a passage such as this, Freud is referring to what we now call the transfer of affects, where the analyst attempts to pick up the patient's feelings that are not readily apparent to consciousness. Like a psychic detective, the analyst must follow the manifest clues leading to the depth interpretations of the patient's unconscious feelings and conflicts and translate, not reduce, I'm not talking about reduction here, and translate them into a language that will hopefully promote deeper self-understanding and symptom relief. People don't like suffering. Over time, Freud recognized that unconscious communication included not only the transfer of the patient's inchoate feeling states, but also knowledge. Sometimes Freud's patients knew things about him that he admittedly had no choice but to describe as telepathy. Freud understood that telepathic knowing, unconscious communication, or thought transfer, is most commonly, but not exclusively, manifested in dream states. At the same time, he insisted there is no such thing as a telepathic dream. Rather, there are dreams that may contain telepathic elements, fragments of experience or knowledge from the waking states of the day's residues that only become clear during a dream. Human beings produce telepathic communications, and dreaming is a function or creation of mind for him. What we consciously allow ourselves to know is not always identical in what we may perceive at the liminal edges of consciousness that later manifest in dreams. Since Freud, a growing number of psychoanalysts are writing about telepathic experiences with patients, most often in the form of a dream a patient has had that contains details about the analyst's own life, private life. Oh, that's funny, private. It isn't really, as we will see. Psychoanalysts have begun to overcome their understandable anxiety about openly discussing these experiences. Part of the reason for this has to do with changing theories of intersubjectivity that yield insights such as the psychological borders demarcating self and other are not as clear as generally assumed. As I will describe in more detail, there's a growing psychoanalytic literature that views demarcations of individual subjectivity as permeable and fluid. Where the self ends and the other begins cannot be as clearly established. And when the minds of the patient and the analyst meet, mingle, or merge in dreams, things become seriously strange. Whose dream? This is the next section. One Monday morning, Kate, who had been in a 4 times weekly analysis with me for a few years, recounted a dream that she had during the previous weekend. You were in a large house, like a 30 styles mansion or a hotel. I think it was on a beach, it was by an ocean. The house had several large rooms, lots of chandeliers, like ballrooms, and you were always with large groups of people, talking to them, drinking something, coffee, listening to others. It was really a beautiful place where you were, this huge mansion-type house on a beach at the edge of a large sea or an ocean. I think maybe it had a pool. You seemed to be having a good time. On the weekend in question, I'd attended a conference at an Art Deco-style hotel in Southern California that had an outdoor pool overlooking the beach and ocean beyond. This particular conference had no concurrent panels, but was organized around consecutive plenary sessions. This meant I was always with large groups of people in the hotel ballroom where the speakers presented. Lots of chandeliers, yes. In the breaks between papers, the conference participants gathered for coffee and continued conversation. It was stimulating. It was very pleasant for me. I never told her about this. There was no reason to tell her. There was no break. It was from a Thursday to a Sunday. There was no reason to let her know that I'd even be out of town, right? So nothing had to be rescheduled. It was highly unlikely that she could have known anything about my plans to attend it. As she described her dream, I experienced a physical, visceral shock. Quite truthfully, it scared me. My patient had dreamed my weekend in astonishingly accurate detail. So in cases like that, when I don't know what's happening, I just shut up. At some point, I did ask her for associations feebly, and she didn't have any. Well, no surprise there. In the early years of analytic work, Kate was very invariably anxious around breaks if we had to miss a session. She said she was frightened she'd never see me again. It was difficult for her to hold me in her mind and feel an ongoing internal connection with me. Kate needed concrete demonstrations of care, not only from me, her therapist, but other people. She could only feel reassurance, for example, of her boyfriend's love in moments of sexual intimacy. When he traveled for work, she became frightened that he would forget about her. For her, out of sight literally meant out of mind. She often worried that I might one day just disappear. On a conscious level, Kate worried something bad might happen to me. However, unconsciously, she was terrified that I would forget her, that she was as invisible to me as she always was to her neglectful parents. Sometimes I would give her a small object from my consulting room just to take with her. Once I gave her, she asked for my pen, the pen that I used to write notes in the early days when I wrote notes in a session. And she would, during the times when we would have a session, I was on vacation, she would have her own little session with me in her mind, right? So she needed to have these things because without them, her very fragile sense of ontological security, as Artie Lang would say, was imperiled. I gave her a number where she could reach me. She never did. She just needed to know that she could. Very important, right? And having the number written down in my handwriting, very important to her, right? And when I came back, we were able to talk about her fantasies, her feelings, what she went through. So because these kinds of arrangements were only negotiated for extended periods where sessions were missed, I didn't tell her anything, right? As far as she knew, I would just be away for just a weekend like any other. But her dream showed something else. And what it showed in part from a psychoanalytic perspective was that important work had been taking place between us outside of the awareness of us both, right? I knew that she'd been developing an increasingly robust capacity for object constancy to be able to hold me, remain mentally connected with me in periods of separation. But I could not have known just to what extent she was able to find me, maintain contact with me wherever I was. These dreams are not particularly new or rare by now in the psychoanalytic literature. Psychoanalysts are becoming more confident about writing about this. We can say a lot about telepathic communication. I can say a lot about it. Freud said a lot about it, but we don't know how it works. We don't know how it works scientifically. We don't know what the technology of it is, but that doesn't really bother me very much. Freud wondered if it might be a vestige, a leftover primordial capacity of some form of proto-language. He didn't know, but he kept insisting that dreams in themselves are not telepathic. They had to be interpreted, they had to be explored like every other dream. This tells me, though, that he may have accepted telepathy as a kind of a super normal capacity in the sense that my very good friend and colleague Jeff Kripal might call it super normal, or Frederick Myers or William James before him, part of the mind's capacity. In the cases of telepathic dreaming, apparently the apparent telepathically acquired knowledge on the part of the patient, when Freud was confronted with that, he focused on the relationship with the patient. He didn't worry about how it happened. He went back to the relationship. He wasn't interested in trying to explain the accuracy of detail in such dreams because he couldn't, and I don't think anybody can. But that didn't stop him, and nor should it stop us from talking about this, from trying to have honest conversations without feeling defensive, without feeling shamed, without feeling frightened. These things happen, and it's vital to clinical work that we talk about it. A growing number of psychoanalysts, however, want not only to explain how it actually works, but they seem to feel a need to prove it. And I have some thoughts about that. I'm not going to get into that right now. Maybe we can do that at some other time. But what Kate's dream told me was that this was a powerful psychic remnant of a traumatic past that was characterized by sustained dread of loss. And I think with her, and here I think of Donald Winnicott, the thing that she dreaded was the thing that already happened to her, right? She was locked in that circle of traumatic dread. It already happened. And so she feared really losing me. She sensed a shift. It wasn't a shift. She said, here I think Oedipal dynamics, thinking about Oedipal dynamics are very helpful. Now, when I say Oedipal, I don't mean anything as vulgar and crude as, little boys wanting to have sex with their mothers. And that's not what Freud meant either. We're talking about patterns. We're talking about what it feels like when you are confronted with the reality you're not as special as you thought you were. You're not as privileged as you thought you were. Your beloved might have other interests besides you. And I think that was what she was detecting with me, that my kind of excitement about this conference, my work, my intercourse with my work, with my profession, that she was very much of a part of, like the child in the triangle. There was more to it than just about her. I think she sensed that. And because of her history, this made sense to me. That's the way this is the way I'm thinking about, for example, Oedipal dynamics. And in the study of religions, then it shows us how to compare these kinds of patterns, right, that come up in the literature, in the history of religions, in psychoanalysis, without collapsing them into crude vulgarities. Okay, that's I just wanted to say that. And I didn't, by the way, have, travel brochures lying around my office. There was no Beach Boys music in the background, nothing like that. I didn't take calls from my travel agent, right? But I was really happy to be going to this conference, and I really love California. So anytime I get a chance, right? So after my shock of hearing her dream, I tried to focus on her relationship. I tried to our relationship. I tried to think about, the intense dependent transference. I'm thinking of Michael Bayland here, who was very helpful to me. That her dream, as he would say, was a desperate means of communication, whereby she was trying to get my full attention. She was sensing my full attention. I was not on her. That it was being shared. There was a rival somewhere along there. So by joining me in her dream, she let me know that she had acquired a capacity to regulate the painful anxiety around separation by creating me or dreaming me up or conjuring me in her mind, and thus protecting our relationship. I might be far away, but we could still be together, something like that. But more importantly for me, it showed me that vital psychological changes were taking place both within Kate and within our analytic relationship that I had to now really start paying attention to. When I thought about it, I was in my being stunned over this. It's a very helpful quote from Barbara Ehrenreich, when she wrote about her mystical experience at Lone Pine, when she said, when something has happened that you don't have words for, keep thinking. And that's what I tried to do, was to keep thinking. about our relationship. And Ballant was quite helpful to me here when he wrote that in order to study parapsychological phenomena profitably, we should not concentrate on either the subject's receptive powers or the healer's or agent's influencing powers, but rather on the powers inherent in their mutual relationship. And that's the clinical piece that's very important for me to think about here. Consider from Freud's perspective, Kate's unconscious awareness of my unconscious but subtle preoccupation of something more than her remained unformulated until she could access it in a dream, right? In her dream, Kate was able to create a telepathic bridge, linking the multiple layers of distance she sensed were coming between us. But it turned out not to be a one-way street. On hearing this case recently, New York psychoanalyst Stanley Cohen stunningly complicated things for me with his observation that not only did Kate find me in her dream, but that I somehow took her with me. And let me tell you, I didn't see that one coming. I did not see that one coming. He might be right. And as you can see, she's here today because you are all now conjuring Kate up in your mind. You are dreaming Kate into existence as I'm talking about her, right? Okay. So I'm going to skip some parts here to go to a section on, so I'm trying to think about this psychoanalytically, right? This is not to say that this is the only way. I like to hold our theories lightly. I always tell my students this. And I think of our theories as cables, as strands and cables, right? That the cable is as strong as it is because of all the different parts. And so what I want to do is be open to dialogue and discussion. And just to sort of present, as I did in my book, and here, how we think about this psychoanalytically without closing the doors, without closing all the doors. So one person I turn to, who's a really fascinating and interesting kind of a bridge here, is the theory of Hans Lowald, right? Who is one of the best interpreters and builders and extenders of Freud, I think, that there is, right? And when he thinks about the infant-mother relationship as a kind of a psychic love matrix that is generated by both the mother and child, but it also envelops them both, right? Which is very important. They exist together in mutual empathic communication that is punctuated by oscillating fusion states, but also gradually developing states of difference or differentiation, he calls it. So the boundaries between self and other are fluid and permeable in early infancy. Now, this view of his draws upon and enlarges Freud's idea of the mind where ego and superego formation is a process of differentiation that emerges or shades out of a common source, which is the id, his later term for the unconscious. A reasonably healthy mother is able to open her mind both to receive and read the mind of her infant. In healthy enough environments, the infantile sense of self in and with other constitutes the unconscious source of potential artistic and intellectual creativity, including mystical or spiritual experiences of unity or oneness with the world that are experienced sometimes in adulthood. These mystical states, the unio mystica, that occurs in adulthood, draws upon, I'm drawing on Lowald and Freud here actually together, draws upon unconscious memory traces of these infantile fusion states with the mother. Lowald's idea of the psychic matrix is the originary source rooted in real experience. This is the real experience of infancy, he thinks, of what may later may be revived in experiences that individuals deem to be spiritual and mystical. They have their roots in the mother-child love matrix or psychic matrix. Psychoanalysis allows Lowell to postulate the existence of this shared psychic matrix that flows around and through both who occupy these shifting points in dynamic, fluid psychic energy systems that is not, it's not to be conceived as a, in here and an out there, or a self-other, but these points in this fluid sort of psychic matrix. I mean, language starts to fail, right? That they generate, that they create, but also that creates them in some kind of a way, right? So the conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche then for Lowell foster and strengthen these interconnecting linkages through a developmental process of psychic differentiation. And they can be vulnerable to many distortions over the course of psychological development through trauma, through neglect, and all of that, whereby then these states can become experienced in a very terrifying way as other, right? And so we're possessed, or other things, exist in us, and so on. In more optimal environmental conditions, these psychic linkages between mental states can be established and cultivated. The unconscious for Lowell and Freud provides a resource of vitality and creative energy that enlivens our conscious awareness and action. We're able to integrate a variety of emotional states within our larger personalities and then claim them as our own. The interpenetrability of linking of mental states within the mind facilitates possibilities for connection between or with other minds and or transcendent realities. These experiences of these realities, the sense of the existence of sacred spirits, a sense of merger with the universe, negative and positive, are most often understood as types of spiritual communion with transcendent dimensions. The history of religions is replete with these stories. And so I like to bring psychoanalysis and the study of religions together in a dialogue so we can learn more, get deeper understanding into and knowledge about what I call the universal factor, that's the human, and our shared human reality. Lowell also, much more than Freud, much beyond Freud, thought that the subjectivity, that our subjectivity, the permeable boundaries of subjectivity that we reside in, that we generate, and that somehow creates us, he saw this somewhere as situated in a kind of a cosmic consciousness. In other words, that nature is conscious, nature has a mind. He didn't go too far with that, but that is where he broke with or went in a different direction from the irreligious theories of Freud. Now I come to something a little more recent, and John Beebe, you mentioned James Grotstein. So I want to give you a sense of where contemporary psychoanalysis seems to be going here. And what I try to argue in the book, what I'm detecting in the book, is that contemporary psychoanalysis is really working with a very different notion of the unconscious than Freud. And you see this in writers like James Grotstein, who, as you know, is very influenced by Wilfred Bion, and this notion of O, the idea of O, or the ineffable, the numinous, the ultimate reality. And somehow this reality, this O, it's very sort of complicated thing, so I'm going to be very brief about it. I'm painting in broad brushstrokes here. Becomes instantiated in individual human minds, right? Through dreams that are and what minds do and what the analyst helps the patient do is metabolize, is to titrate and metabolize this influx of this O, or this ineffable ultimate reality, in ways that allow the patient to live in the world and not become psychotic. right? Not be flooded, not be overwhelmed. Because this is dangerous stuff. This is really this can be very dangerous territory, and analysts need to know, what they're doing. So I talk about Grotstein and the ways in which James Grotstein thinks of the psychoanalytic practice as a kind of a mystical enterprise. And the analyst is a mystic. And the analytic enterprise is a spiritual kind of a journey, right? That's what he is doing, which is, I mentioned this once to a colleague of the late James Grotstein at a conference I was at in Boston. He got very angry. Grotstein, he never said that. He never thought that. He didn't have any idea of a cosmic mind. I don't know. I mean, I'm just reading, right? I mean, it's right. It's just like it's on the page. But so but that's to sort of let you know that there's a lot of defensiveness around this. People get nervous. This is woo-woo stuff or New Age. As a scholar of religions, I take New Age religions very seriously. And I do locate people like James Grotstein and other analysts like Elizabeth Lloyd-Mayer, people who are writing about this. I do locate them in the history of esotericism. I do locate them in New Age religions, but not in a way to diminish or make fun of. These have very long traditions behind them. So psychoanalysis, or a very strong trajectory of psychoanalysis, is going in this direction at the moment, and Grotstein is a major figure in this. And I write about that and how this is very different from Freud, and is working with actually a notion of the unconscious that doesn't come from Freud. It comes from William James. This is where it comes from. It's not the unconscious, it's what James called the subconscious, or later, under the influence of Frederick Myers, the subliminal mind. And by the way, as you may know, both William James and Frederick Myers, the Cambridge classicist, who was very, very much the forefront of psychical research in the late 19th century, were very important influences on Carl Jung, that he admits they're very important influences on his thinking, right? Grotstein can't let Freud go sometimes, and Grotstein tries very much to, at times, make Freud into almost a closet mystic. And some people have tried to do this, David Bacon, various others, can't do it, people. Doesn't work, can't do it. He's irreligious, but he's not the cranky atheist that, popular kind of opinion. So what I want to show here is that there is a very, the intellectual ancestors of contemporary American, it's distinctively American, I think, not exclusively, but quite distinctively American psychoanalysis, goes back to James and Myers, and then Jung. They don't talk about Jung, though, very much in their work, which is kind of interesting. I don't know why, but they don't. Bion and Grotstein, this is the line. And Freud is going off to it's like the evolutionary tree. Some lines die out, and I think that may well be happening. Myers and James, one of the things to know about William James is to really grasp his psychology, one has to also be very aware of the importance of psychical research in his work, in his thinking, and in his life. And their idea of a kind of a cosmic consciousness that, and the filter thesis I think was talked about earlier, this kind of filter thesis where we are instantiations of this cosmic consciousness, and in some way when we die, it's not that we return as such, like our individual personalities, although James grappled with that. He wondered about maybe bits or pieces of that's how the only way he could interpret, spirit communication was maybe there are bits or elements of the human personality that are preserved, maybe, and they somehow get caught or they get brought into in our channel in seance activity. But more than that, I think that their psychology offers a very rich resource for understanding what I call in my book mystical or spiritual psychoanalysis. the idea of the subliminal mind or the subliminal self, and the ways in which this subliminal mind, I don't know, how would you put it, shades off into or somehow goes, that the barrier goes into a kind of a cosmic mind, or the mind of nature, as Lowell would say, that in certain ways, with certain practices, and psychoanalysis now with people like Grotstein being one way, that is a way to achieve some kind of not only higher knowledge, but perhaps deepened psychic health in somehow connecting with that source. You can't have an unconscious in the sense that Freud is writing about. And I don't say that to denigrate Freud at all. He's working with a very different idea. There are ways in which I think that there might be contiguous moments between Myers and James and Freud, but they're also very different. The other thing I want to say too is that as Freud talked about telepathy, which he acknowledged, he believed, he knew it happened, he experienced it, he tried to establish very strong boundaries around it. He was sure science could explain it one day. He would not have anything to do with any sort of spiritual or mystical ideas. And he hoped that analysts would be able to hold that tension, to acknowledge it, but also keep it very psychoanalytic, kind of in the way that I was talking about Kate and the way I linked it up with theories with Lowell and so on. But I think he may well have inadvertently opened up actually a door, or opened up a portal for a revitalized, a renewed, and reconstructed spiritual or mystical psychoanalysis that is able to, it hasn't done this yet. It's very interesting. Most of the analysts I write about hardly ever mention William James. Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer does, but briefly, they rarely, Grotstein, no, they don't that will help us then bring to maybe awareness or consciousness the unconscious dimensions of our ancestral intellectual history by, and this is what I'm attempting to do, by bringing James and Myers into the conversation, so that psychoanalysis can then maybe get over some of the conceptual slippages and confusions that it's engaging in. When it talks about the unconscious, the term is almost meaningless these days, right? What do we mean by the unconscious? So I want to say that, no, we're not talking about the unconscious when we talk about mystical or spiritual or paranormal or psychic experiences and phenomena. We're talking about the subliminal mind or subliminal self, which I think would be really a good idea to bring back in a much more a conscious way, so that we can engage with it as we acknowledge our ancestral, or psychoanalysis, ancestral sort of origins, but also then engage with it to revitalize and reconstitute. In the process of this, I think that Freud and many of his ideas are going to the evolutionary sort of maybe extinction. So that's something of what I wanted to say, and I'm going to stop because I'm out of time. So thank you very much.